Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sara Bonella. For those of you who do not know me, I am the Deputy Director here in CICAM and one of the PIs in Marvel. So with both my hats on, it's a real pleasure to welcome you who are in the room, crowded room, very nice, and the people who are following us online to this Mary-Ann Manside conversation. Now, just to frame picture a little bit, in 1955, Mary-Ann Manside had just graduated with a major in applied math and a minor in chemistry from the University of Minnesota, replied to an ad in an American newspaper titled Men Wanted. Mary-Ann Manside replied to the Men Wanted ad from the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And what the Lawrence Livermore Lab was looking for were people who would be interested in this new thing called computer coding. The Livermore Lab was one of the few places on the planet where there was a supercomputer. It was largely there because of military uses, but occasionally they let scientists on to play a bit with the machines. Now, one of the persons who had access to this machine was Bernie Older. Those of you who deal with molecular dynamics probably know the name. He's one of the founding fathers of our science. And Bernie, who was an excellent scientist, but has never touched a computer in his entire life and certainly never wrote a line of code, used Mary-Ann, with the help of another brilliant physicist called Tom Wainwright, to write the first molecular dynamics code that has ever been put into existence, and to modify that code over a period of 35 years to run calculations going from hard spheres to argon atoms to the type of complicated systems that we're used to studying today. Mary-Ann was there all the time, working on the code, making sure that it worked and it worked fast, and that she could use any free computer time on the machines. In a story that is somewhat typical of that period, she was occasionally acknowledged on the papers published by Bernie and Tom, but she never appeared as an author. So we at Marvel and CICAM felt that this was something that needed to be somehow corrected. And in 2019, we invited her here to Lausanne to tell us a little bit about her life and work. You can find that first conversation of what then became a series online, both on the CICAM and the Marvel websites. And I highly recommend it if you're curious about the history of our domain. So following up on that, we felt that it would be a good idea to invite people who, are important for the job we do as scientists, but may not be necessarily scientists. Today, we have, for example, a conversation on the process of science writing and editing. And it is my pleasure to just, give you a little bit of intro, like I just did, and steal 5 minutes of your time to say that, in addition to this type of meetings, we also have other joint activities between CICAM and Marvel that may be worthwhile your attention. So in particular, there are a few upcoming events. Some are for, one of the two centers and the others are in common. So we start with the Marvel Distinguished Lecture on May the 2nd, Massimiliano Di Ventra, when memory becomes a computing tool. Then we have a CICAM Marvel Classic. These are lecture series in which we invite pioneers, inventors of new methods that have then become sort of established objects in our toolbox, to explain to us how they came up with the ideas that are now, the algorithms that we always use. And so we've invited Shoshana Wodak and Bill Jorgensen, who will be with us on June 5th, to talk about biosimulation. Anyone who's running free energy calculations on any kind of system should know the name of Bill Jorgensen, and Shoshana was a pioneer of protein-protein simulations. And then on the 27th of January, David Sepperly and Claudia Filippi will come and describe for us quantum Monte Carlo methods. In September, we will celebrate with a relatively large conference the 55th birthday of CICAM. So you're all invited to come and join us between the 2nd and the 4th of September. If you want to participate online, there is a registration deadline. That's May 31st, and the website where you can register is indicated here. That's really all I wanted to sort of sell as upcoming events. But going back to today, after a very short intro by me and by Nicola Nosego, who is the communication officer of the Marvel NCCR and will act as moderator and chairperson for this session, we'll dive into 2 talks. Then we're going to take a short break just to rearrange the room to put us all in the mood and take care of any bio necessities. And then we can reorganize the room to put us in the mood for the second part of today's event, which is a very informal and hopefully lively discussion with our esteemed invited guests to, get to know each other a bit better, understand a bit better the type of work that they do. And if this is something that could be interesting for you, both, as people who write papers and then have to know what is the process for these papers to be published in journals, or who knows, maybe because you might want to consider a career in scientific editing and writing for yourselves. That's really all I had to say. Thank you very much for being with us. Nicola, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us in person or online. I'm Nicola Nosego. I'm the communication officer and science writer of NCCR Marvel. I am a science journalist myself, so I'm not exactly an external observer, let's say, to the topic that we are discussing here today. And indeed, together with Sarah, with Nicola Marzari and all the CHECAM and Marvel teams, we thought that it would be interesting, and we think this very nice turnout is proof to that. It would be interesting to dedicate one of these conversations not to a scientific topic in the strict sense of research, of discussion on research results or research methods, but to create an opportunity to learn something about and to discuss about 2 things that can have a very high and strong impact on the career of scientists, and that are also career opportunities in themselves for people with a PhD or with a scientific training. That are journal publishing, so the process by which the results of research become journal articles, and science journalism, which is the process by which science is scrutinized by journalists, communicated to a larger public in sometimes also critical way. So as I said, we thought that it was also interesting to present these fields as possible career choices for people with a scientific training. And indeed, we invited 2 speakers today who have a background as working scientists in the physical and chemical sciences, who are Nina Mainzer, who is a senior editor at Nature Physics, and Mark Piplo, who is a science journalist who used to be a news editor at Nature and before Nature at Chemistry World, and who is now a freelance journalist. And I would say one first take-home message that will now be elaborated in the talks, which is a very important one, is that these are 2 very different jobs. Because sometimes, for a number of reasons, they can be confused, and indeed maybe language doesn't help, because of course they can both work for journals. Journal and journalism are 2 variations of the same word. They can both have the title of editors, and they can even work in these different roles for the same publications, because for example, Nature has both a journalistic part and a science publishing part. So there is often a confusion about these roles, which are actually very different. And so that was also a reason why we wanted to have them both as speakers today, to give you a sense of these different functions that these jobs serve in the ecosystem of scientific information. But I'm already talking too much, so I would now like to introduce our first speaker, who will be Nina Mainzer from Nature Physics. So Nina has a background in physics, Karlsruhe University first, up to the PhD, and then a postdoc at the University of Exeter in the UK, if I remember well. She specialized in particular on plasmonic metamaterials, is that right, as a researcher. And she switched to journal editing in 2016, I think, first at Nature Communication, which is a more interdisciplinary journal in the Nature family, and then Nature Physics, where she's now in charge, in particular of all the optical physics part, I think, but also contents across, let's say, side contents across all the fields. One last reminder before leaving the floor to Nina: for those who are attending online, you can use the Q&A tool in the webinar to ask questions. We will be viewing them from here, and we will be relaying them to the speakers. We can have maybe just a couple of quick questions at the end of the talk, but then we will save most of it for the final discussion at the end involving both speakers. Nina, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for everybody for coming either to the room or to your computers online, at home, or wherever you are. Just before I start, very briefly about the presentation. I did decide to start with quite a lengthy part of sort of details of my career, because I am asked quite often, especially for people at your career stage when I meet them at conferences, how do you actually become an editor? What do you need to do? So there's quite a bit here. Nicola touched upon pretty much everything, but maybe I can give you a bit more detail how I actually then ended up being an editor and not a professor or something like some of my friends did, or work in industry. Although it is very similar actually to their paths to an extent. But I'll try not to go into too much detail there. Right, so how I became an editor. As Nicola said, I did my undergraduate in physics, just general physics. At the time, that was still called a diploma in Germany. I'm not sure if it was the same in Switzerland. I think it was at some point. Now you would call it a master's. It's a 5-year degree. You have to do everything, cover sort of the basics of physics, and then you can pick and choose a few things. I did not specialize in optics originally. I did a lot of solid state condensed matter physics because, like most people on my undergrad, especially the first few years, I thought, who the hell would be doing optics? That was all sorted in the 18th century. Yeah, no. I then ended up in a seminar course where we had to give talks on a prepared topic. And that happened to be around nanophotonics and nonlinear optics and a bit more modern concepts of optics. And that's sort of how I started to fall in love with these plasmonic things where you can use geometry to actually change the physical properties and responses of a thing. And I got on quite well with the tutors, the postdocs who were organizing the seminar. Yeah. And well, they offered me to do my diploma thesis in their group. The diploma thesis in Germany then was an entire year basically working in a group. You don't have lectures anymore. It's basically a mini PhD. You do 9 months in the lab or in front of a computer if you're doing calculations, or in front of a notepad with a pencil, do your work, and then you write up whatever comes out or doesn't come out. And I worked on single particle spectroscopy, so not single molecules, but single plasmonic particles, which I'm sure is fairly familiar to quite a lot of people here. While I was working on that master thesis or diploma thesis in a group that was quite ambitious, still is, all of us had big ambitions. Our professor was quite an ambitious person and everything. Nature Photonics launched. And that was the first time when I, who'd always had an interest in language, in writing, in journalism, I legit told my mother in year 11, Mum, I'm going to quit school and just become a journalist. And she should just say, no, you're not, thankfully. So I'd always had that interest. But the launch of Nature Photonics was the first time that I saw, hang on, there is a job out there, or several jobs, where you actually need to combine a scientific expertise with an interest in language and writing and research and all of those things. So that was the first time that sort of in my head there was a seed of, maybe I want to be an editor later on. But minimum requirement for a nature editor is a PhD. So on I went and did a PhD, still in the same lab. Only the name of the institution had miraculously changed at the time. Just so happened that it now looks like I have those degrees from different institutions. I didn't. Same lab, didn't change anything. Now, my PhD was quite a frustrating experience, and I'm pretty sure I'm not alone there. We set out with an ambitious project of making a metamaterial laser. That was the fashion at the time. We knew it was complicated, we knew it may not work, but around about 2 years into my PhD, I didn't have results yet. And that didn't exactly feel good. So the whole thing then eventually turned into quite a detailed parameter study of combining a gain material with a metamaterial and what happens if you change certain parameters. Got me a PhD, but wasn't exactly exciting. So it was fun, but it was also frustrating. And of course, it was a lot of work, but it always is. But the other part of my PhD was that I was embedded in our graduate school. So that was one reason for the change of the name, was the German Excellence Initiative. And one thing we got was this graduate school that still exists, the KSOP, which stands for Karlsruhe School of Optics and Photonics. And we were embedded in that. And it's an interdisciplinary graduate school for everybody who deals with optics. So there were biologists there were engineers there were chemists there were physicists there. We didn't yet have computer scientists. I think now there are a few, but it's quite a broad spectrum. And you do have little seminars like this together also where the students are presenting, and you have courses together on presenting and writing and management and all those sorts of things. So it was a good experience for me. I really enjoyed this interdisciplinary exchange and talking about your research with people from completely different backgrounds and hearing what they're doing. And you're already learning a skill of how to tell people who are not in your group, who don't speak the same scientific language as you, about what you're doing. Despite everything, all the frustration, I did end up graduating. This is my lovely thesis, and don't know if you have that tradition here. In Germany, there's this, at least in some universities, this tradition of a doctoral card. So you have this lovely card that is decorated by your group with all sorts of random things to make fun of you that remind them of things that happened either with you or during the PhD. And after you pass your viva, you're wheeled through the department into the lectures and everywhere, and people can cheer you. And the idea is sort of, oh, you have that title now, but we can still make fun of you. But why I actually put this on here is that I'd obviously been talking about this whole I want to be an editor for so long that one of the things they put on here is a fake announcement that I was the new editor-in-chief. They don't have one of Nature Photonics. They have a chief editor, but that aside. So I clearly had been talking about this a lot. I'm not the chief editor of Nature Photonics. I wish I was. So again, it was there at the back of my mind, but because my PhD had gone a bit badly, I just didn't feel finished with the subject yet. And there happened to be a postdoc opportunity in Exeter with Bill Barnes, who I'd met a year before at a summer school and had got on with, which was very similar, but a bit more broad to my PhD project. It was about combining plasmonic materials or particles with gain materials. So very similar, but I didn't feel finished with this topic. So I applied for this postdoc, got this postdoc somehow, and moved to Exeter to pursue it. Went all right. Didn't want to leave research yet, also didn't want to leave Exeter yet, frankly, because I'd just settled in there, had great friends. Started a second postdoc after 3 years, also in Exeter, but that switched gears a little bit. So the Quest project was essentially transformation optics, but largely with microwave metamaterials. And what I knew, because we had joined group meetings with them, but I didn't quite expect to be quite that jarring to me when I actually had to work with it, they come really more from an engineering mindset. I had at that point become used to some of the engineering language, which really just uses different words for the same things. But it's a very different mindset when you're suddenly in a meeting with your supervisor or your PI, and whatever you suggest, the next question is basically, oh, how could that be applied? Could we possibly put that on the wing of a plane? I don't know, I just want to figure out if it's interesting. What's the interesting science here? So that just did not work for me. And I started to kind of feel, maybe I need to get out of here. But my original plan to get out of there was maybe to apply for a fellowship or find another postdoc. But then life intervened, and not in a good way. So what happened is that I felt worse and worse and worse, and my body got sicker and sicker and sicker, and nobody really knew why. Couldn't walk from here to the door without needing a break. Not fun when you're in your early 30s. And I ended up in hospital and was diagnosed with an illness that I'd never heard of before. And I'm not saying this for people to just have pity with me, but the thing is, if you nearly die, and the guy who diagnosed me literally said 2 weeks later and you would have been dead, and you have a life-changing experience that really changes everything about how you have to live, you start to rethink what you want to do in life. You're not just plodding on anymore, you're really going, right, if this isn't working, I might not have the time to change this, I have to change it now. So once I got better, I sat down and had a look at job openings and fellowships and everything. And it so happened that there were 2 job ads out at Nature, one for a locum at Nature Photonics and one for a permanent position at Nature Communications. I applied for both of them, I interviewed for both of them. I only got one of them, which was the job at Nature Communications. So I packed up my bags and moved to London, which is conveniently also closer to my doctors. I keep telling them that's why I moved. It's not. So 2016, like Nicola said, I started at Nature Communications, which is by now a giant journal with nearly 200 editors. I think I was editor number 38 or something like that, so it was much smaller at the time, around about 30, 40. You could still know everybody, at least roughly. And it's not interdisciplinary, technically it's multidisciplinary. So like Nature, it publishes all the sciences, everything. Of course, if you have something interdisciplinary, it's a good venue because people from different parts of the divide will read it. But papers don't have to be interdisciplinary. Just saying that because when I was there, a lot of people thought they had to be. They don't. They can be purely something. So I switched gears a little bit in terms of topic. No longer did any plasmonics or metamaterials. My colleague Lena did that at the time. I looked after the nonlinear optics, the lasers, and some sorts of other photonics things. At Nature Communications, what you do 99% of your time is you read papers, you make decisions on papers and all the things that I'll tell you about later. Or as I sometimes describe my job, you reject papers, because that's a lot of what I do, sadly. 2018, I got the promotion to senior editor, and a year later, there was another job opening and I moved to Nature Physics. Where I now look after all the optics. So not just a part of it, but all of it. So there was an expansion in remit, but I'm also now looking, you have additional things like our non-primary content. And again, I'll say a bit more about that. So that's all the reviews and news and opinion pieces and the editing, which I personally really like. So I am still leaning a bit towards Mark in what I like doing, although it's still not journalism, nowhere near. And over time, I got the responsibility for looking after all those things, and with that became team leader 2 years ago. So this is how I got there. What do I actually do? Quick question for the people in the room, because I can't see the ones online. Who has published a paper? Doesn't have to be first author, any paper. Right, good. So you roughly know how the process works, the submitting and revisions and all these things. I don't have to tell you too many details about that. Stop me if there's anything you don't understand on the next slide, just stop me and ask. Right, so this is basically my main job, which is how a paper goes through our system. When we get new papers, we read them, we assess them, whether we think they're interesting enough to go out to review or not. Most of them do not go out to review, I'm afraid. So, I don't have the numbers on here, I thought I had. It's something like 70 or 80% of the papers, 70 to 80% of the papers that we just desk reject and don't even review. It's a lot, 70 about. So that's the first editorial decision. We read it, we make the decision. And we either send it back to you and say, sorry, no, somewhere else might be a better venue for this, or we send it out to peer review, in which case I have to manage the peer review. That means finding a sufficient amount of peer reviewers who have the time to do this, ideally quickly, who have the right expertise spread that is needed for this paper, and who also, among the panel, have sort of an overview of the field to tell us where this sits within the existing literature and what the field is currently interested in. We then, managing the peer review doesn't just mean that, we then get the reports back. I also have to read the reports and sort of pick out what are the important things, what might be a point in a report that actually says, hang on, the claims in this paper aren't correct, or they still need to do more work to prove that these things are correct, or are those all just minor things that can be discussed and just adding a bit more things. So I then need to make another decision based on the reports combined with the expertise of the reviewers. If my theory reviewer, for example, tells me, oh, we need more calculations here, they should really check if these numerical things are properly converged, I will take that a lot more seriously than if my theory reviewer tells me, yeah, but maybe they should check a particular setting on the lock-in amplifier, because I'd assume they have less experience with those sort of things. So yeah, that's that editorial decision, and there are these 4 potential decisions. One is an accept that hardly ever happens without any revisions. Don't think I've ever done that. Revisions or major revisions. I think you could already hear that from what I just described around looking into the peer reviewer reports. Major revisions usually means please go and do more experiments, like bigger experiments, not just this is going to take you 5 minutes in the lab to take another shot of an experiment, or do more calculations, or maybe you have to actually develop a bit more theory or numerics or whatever to prove that what you're saying here is actually correct. That's major. A normal revise might be, well, you need to give more context on how this sits in the literature, or maybe you need to explain a bit more here, or give us more parameters of what you've actually done so people can replicate what you've done, and there's enough information in there. Or we outright reject the paper, mostly because from the reviewer reports it looks like the claims don't stand up, but sometimes also because we judge that I could ask for a major revision, but that major revision is likely to take you 2 or 3 years, and we don't want to put that burden on you. It's probably better for you to take the paper as it is and take it somewhere else, rather than add something on just to make it more interesting. If you come back in 2 years and you haven't published it yet and you have extended the paper and that is still interesting, we'll look at it again. But by our judgment, we'd rather you make that call rather than me saying, I think this is interesting, but it needs to be more interesting, so go and do all of that work. So that there is a bit of making sure our authors aren't overburdened as well. This is more or less how editors think, or at least how I usually describe it, when we first read a paper. So how we decide whether something goes out to peer review or not. And yes, we do read all the papers. We actually do, not just the abstracts, not just the cover letters. I actually don't read cover letters half the time, and if I do, I read them after the paper. no biasing me with those things. The two big questions is this going to be worth my readers' time? Because I have a responsibility as an editor, essentially to three groups of people. And in a way, you're all three of them. It's my authors, it's my reviewers, and it's my readers. And most researchers are all of those at a certain point in time. But when it comes to selecting papers, my main responsibility is to my readers, because if they pick up a Nature Physics paper, they want something that is relatively high level impactful. And I somehow have to make that call. And one of the ways we think about it is the question of whether it has the potential to stimulate people's thinking, to give you ideas for your research, to provoke new work, maybe because you want to refute this, or maybe because you can use a specific method, or you can build on it, and it's an important step towards something. So those are the sorts of things we look for. I know this is very vague, but it is very different from paper to paper, even from field to field. What we look for in a biophysics paper specifically will be very different to what my colleagues in quantum simulations look for. But like I said, I have another job, and that's the one I actually like better. Just because after 8 years of reading papers, I'm starting to get bored of reading papers. And this is the main reason I moved to Nature Physics, is the non-primary content, which we also call the reviews, news and opinion, or RNO content, because it describes a bit better what it actually is. I don't know if everybody's familiar with this primary, secondary, all these types of literature. So it's basically all our content that isn't original research. So that's all the review style articles, the reviews and perspectives. It's all the summary and news style articles, like the news and views and the picture stories, the letter we write. But it's also opinion pieces like comments and worldviews, editorials, which are opinion pieces written by us, and our columns, the books and arts, which are book reviews and art installation reviews, and the Measure for Measure, which is our metrology column. Now, I don't actually commission all of those. We publish about 200 of those every year. That's a lot. We publish about 220 papers, so it's a similar amount of things. I look after some of them, or have looked after some of the columns as well in the past. Like all of us will commission news and views, and we'll write editorials and make sure we have a few comments and things. But my other job is to sort of have the overview of the entire journal's pipeline for this content. So I will have regular meetings with everybody where we discuss ideas, where we discuss ideas for bigger projects, where we will flesh out an idea if somebody just says, oh, I would like to write an editorial about, I don't know, how women back in the day weren't cited on papers if they contributed work. That might be quite a vague idea, and then we'll sit down for an hour or so and we'll flesh out how we will tell that story. So there is a bit of that storytelling, journalism element in these things. My job is also to make sure we have the numbers, and I organize and run our meetings around these things. I'll train new editors in all these things and in our house style and how we edit and make things palatable to a wider audience of physicists. That's not the general public, that's a very different audience. And I support my chief editor with any strategy decisions in this particular area, and sometimes a bit more widely, but that is my particular thing. Oh, and then there's the fun part of the job. I just put some pictures, which is going out to conferences and actually meeting people and talking to people, not so much listening to the talks, but just meeting my community and chatting to people and hearing what they're interested in. Possibly my favorite part of the job, but it's also the smallest part of the job because you can't go to a conference every other week, otherwise your work doesn't get done and our budget doesn't stretch that far. Right, we will be talking in our discussion later about publishing and how things are changing there, and I'm sure you've noticed some of them. So I just wanted to say a few words on how publishing is changing. In fact, publishing, or how we could also call it, dissemination of information over the course of human history has always changed in bursts, and usually when new technology came along. So originally it was all oral tradition and people told each other stories, poems or whatever. Not necessarily scientific stories. Then writing came along, people started to write things down. Some people were able to write, some people were able to read. Then printing press was invented, mass literacy emerged, and these things were disseminated even further. And then we got the internet and things just exploded. And scientific publishing works a bit in a similar way. So 400 years ago, science was largely disseminated by what we're doing here, but without the Zoom. By people coming to a meeting of a learned society and presenting what they've done. And who was in the room knew about it, and everybody else didn't. 350-ish years ago, the Royal Society, which is one of those learned societies, then decided actually we could write these things down. And the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society were allegedly the first and are still existing. So they're the oldest scientific journal out there. It's 350 years old. But that was originally basically what people had given as a talk written down and published, a bit like conference proceedings these days. Nowadays, you do just publish your papers there. Just over 150 years ago, Norman Lockyer founded Nature. I put that on there not just because I worked there, but also because it had a slightly different twist to it. So the philosophical transactions and most journals today are aimed at other researchers. Lockyer's idea was that Nature was supposed to be for the general public. It was to put the science before the general public. Now, we can debate later on with Mark, and I think this is one of the points where our jobs very much differ, whether Nature actually puts things before the general public or just before other researchers. I would argue the papers, and that's my main job, are still largely for researchers, but there is enough content in Nature, which is why it has this large magazine content of news items and everything, that still has that mission of presenting science to the general public. So that changed the game a little bit. Now in 2024, we actually have nearly 30,000 scientific journals out there, whereas for hundreds of years it was a handful. And they're all, I mean, not all of them will be publishing in English, but it is sort of converging to mostly English as a lingua franca, whereas originally it was very much, you had German ones, you had probably still Latin ones, you had English ones, you had whatever, Italian ones. Nowadays you still have Chinese and Japanese and Russian ones, but it's less and less the case, that most of them are international. Now, as I said, the internet changes things, and this is sort of leading into my next slide. A lot of people have, well, we've all been talking about open access a lot recently, and a lot of people have this perception that open access is a new thing. It's not. It's basically as old as the internet. The archive server started in 1991. That's over 30 years ago. So that's preprints have been around for longer than Nature Physics. They'll be 20 next year. So they're not really new in that sense. It's just that they've become more prominent and the way they're used has changed. When I did my PhD, I remember we were still discussing, can we actually cite an archive paper in a paper? Is that okay to have that as a reference, or do we need to wait until it's published? Whereas today, that's not even a question. And in 2000, again, when the internet became bigger, not sure if you're aware of Biomed Central and PubMed Central, BMC claims to be the first and largest open access only publisher. Never mind if they're the first, they're one of the first. And who cares if they're the largest, but that already started in around 2000. And PubMed Central is arguably the largest open access post-publication repository with an embargo at that point. Now, what has changed recently is that we have open access mandates, and they were a giant change for the publishing industry, and probably also for researchers. Back in the day, when I was a researcher, the thing was, yeah, if you want to publish open access, you do. If you want to publish in that journal, it's open access, you do. There were good reasons for it. There were bad reasons for it. But you do what we want. These days, your funders will tell you, you have to publish open access in a specific way. There are exact rules for when the thing has to be where, in what repository, in which thing, how long you've got to get the thing online. And that is largely driven by funders and librarians. Plan S, you've heard of that probably, that's actually a librarian consortium. So most of the mandates are for immediate open access. So the embargoes we used to have and still have on submission content, which means you could put it on your website or in a repository like PubMed Central after 6 months, they're no longer okay, which means you have to pay for open access or get into copyright wars with the publishers, which I wouldn't recommend. We have lawyers. But overall, for both researchers and the publishing industry, it means that fewer researchers and less research can actually be published in a subscription journal because most funders won't allow it anymore. So we had to react and offer more OA options, which we do, but they come at a price. And I just want to very briefly say, because you can't do it without today, the potentially next big one might be right on our feet immediately after the OA, and that is that AI might, of course, change everything. It might not. We'll see. I can tell you that the publishing industry is already looking into applications for generative AI. There were already AI translated books out there, summary written content. For now, I have to say that it's mostly a copyright-related headache because a lot of people use AI images and stuff, and that's legally a minefield. I'm pretty sure we will see an AI assist coming very, very soon. But if it will replace editors, probably not just yet. If it will in 10, 20 years' time, I don't know. Personally, I don't think so anytime soon, but that's mostly for human psychology reasons. And we can talk about the details later if you're interested.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina.
You're welcome.
It was amazing. Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Maybe we give precedence to the room. Quick ones, maybe. Unless you have something, Sarah, from online.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first one is, could you please explain how the transfer process happened? How do you decide if the paper should be transferred or rejected? And will you treat the paper differently if you did a new paper or a transferred one?
So how I decide if a paper should be transferred, not at all. All I do, or all we do, is give people a recommendation that, sorry, it doesn't work for us, but it might work for Nature Communications. And then the authors can decide whether they want to click that link and transfer or not. So that is purely author choice. What I do is just a recommendation. Also, if I suggest Nature Comms, you can still click that link and transfer to Nature Photonics, all your choice. Do I treat it differently? No, not if it comes as a transfer without review. If it comes as a transfer post-review, I have the joy of actually getting the reviewer reports from the previous journal. So I will, of course, take those into account. But I basically treat it like if it was a post-review paper on my desk, on my journal.
And how do perspectives work in Nature? Are those only made under invitation?
Most of the time. You can pitch them to us. but I would not recommend.
You can't.
You can pitch them, you are able to pitch them, it's fine. I would not recommend writing them and sending them in, but if you have an idea, you can always email us and we can discuss details.
Most of them are commissioned.
Most of them are commissioned, some of them, I'd say with us at least about a third of the review's content comes in.
Yeah.
Uncommissioned, but again, that might just be us talking at a conference and me going, yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Good. Oh, yes, we have one more and then we.
Yes, I wanted to discuss how many papers per week roughly do you get as an editor?
About 10 new ones. Yeah.
That's big enough.
Yeah, you read a lot. I probably read more than any of you. I hope I do.
Good. Thanks again, Nina. I think we'll have a lot of things to discuss with us. And now let's move to the other half. Within nature stuff, people often refer to the front half and the back half, referring to when there was.
We're not allowed to say that anymore.
Yeah, because there's no print magazine anymore, but the old jargon was back half and front half. Front half is the journalistic part because it was the first part of the magazine, and back half is the research part. And hearing now from the perspective of science journalism, I would like to invite Mark Peploe to give the next talk. Mark is a chemist by training, University of Oxford, then Imperial College, if I remember well, for PhD, then a postdoc in Canada. And then he also, like Nina, switched to a different career path and became a science journalist. Maybe he will tell us a little bit how that happened. And he was editor of Chemistry World for a couple of years before becoming a news editor for Nature 2009 to 13, something like that, I think.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. But just to say that I had the pleasure to work quite a bit with Mark when he was news editor in Nature, because I was freelancing for Nature with stories from Italy quite a lot at the time, and it was great. I think he's a great editor, and so I'm very pleased to have him here today. Now he's a freelance, working for a number of publications, including still Nature quite a lot, and mostly focusing on chemistry, materials, clean technologies, etc. Mark, please join me. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. I really appreciate you coming along. And thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you indeed for inviting me to the Mary Ann Manside conversation. I am genuinely honoured and delighted to be here. I'll confess that I'd not actually heard of Mary Ann Manside before being invited to give this talk. So I was really interested to read about her pioneering work in programming at the Livermore Laboratory in the area of molecular dynamics, and also how she was long denied proper scientific credit for her work and paid lower wages than men doing equivalent position in equivalent positions. I think that science journalism actually has a really important role to play in correcting things like that, in highlighting the true contributions of scientists, both historically and in the present day. The increasing focus that we see on recognizing the work of underrepresented groups in science has really become a major topic in some newsrooms over the past 10 to 20 years. And it's something that I'm going to return to later in the talk. But before that, I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of science journalism, what it is, how it works, and why it matters. I'm going to give you some insights about how science journalism is done at Nature in particular, and I'll look at some of the issues surrounding journalism in your areas of science, including modelling and materials science. And then I'm going to wrap up with a look at how science journalism is changing and what's driving that. So first, I ought to give you a very brief overview of how I got here. And as Nicola said, I did a PhD in chemistry at Imperial College in London, a one-year postdoc in Canada, but I had always loved talking and writing about science. So I went back to Imperial to do a master's, a one-year master's in science communication. My first job after that was as a press officer. I'm going to explain some of these things in a moment. But in 2004, I went to work for Nature as an online news reporter, covering all of the physical sciences, everything from earth sciences to cosmology and everything in between. I was then editor of Chemistry World magazine for a couple of years. That's published by the Royal Society of Chemistry. I went back to Nature in 2008 to be their chief news editor, so ultimately responsible for all of their news output. I did that for 5 years, and I have been freelance since 2013. So it's worth explaining some of those job titles to you. Firstly, what is a science journalist? Well, it's someone who's involved in telling stories about science through writing or audio or TV or other media. Some journalists are called reporters. They have conversations with scientists, and those are called interviews. They digest them and they use that information in weaving the story together. Journalists called editors make decisions about what stories should be told and how they should be told. At the most basic level, that might involve just moving words around on a page. There are other editors called sub-editors. Those are involved in checking facts in a story and making sure it's understandable to an average reader or listener. Now, some of these journalists at a publication like Nature are staffers. They work on staff. They are full-time employees of a publishing company. But a lot of reporters and editors, like me, are freelance. We work for ourselves and we do jobs, but on a story-by-story basis for any outlet that will pay us. I typically write about chemistry, materials, clean tech, pharmaceuticals, and I do that from a science point of view. Here's a new scientific discovery, but also from a policy and business point of view as well, because all of those things, especially clean tech, you can't talk about one without the other two. Science, policy, and business all absolutely intertwined. Writing takes up about half of my time. The rest is freelance editing, and that covers any scientific topic, the editing. I do most of my work for Nature, Nature Biotechnology, Chemical and Engineering News, which is published by the American Chemical Society, PNAS, a few other magazines. I also mentioned in my little resume, press officers. That was my first job. So press officers are people employed by universities or businesses or governments to liaise with journalists and put their organisation's point of view into the media. The press officer's work might include writing a press release, which is itself a story about science, and that gets distributed to journalists in the hope that it will tempt them to write about it. So while press officers serve their institutions, journalists are primarily concerned with serving our readers. I was really interested that Nina made the same point, that the reader is always the primary focus of who I am serving. Same with journalists. Our aim is to give the reader something that's interesting, enlightening, as true as can be, and hopefully even entertaining to read. This focus, laser-like focus on serving the reader, was nicely described years ago by a venerable science editor of The Guardian newspaper in the UK, a guy called Tim Radford, who set down a manifesto for the simple scribe. It was essentially 25 commandments for journalists. I just want to read you the first few, which I've abridged a little bit. When you sit down to write, there is only one important person in your life. This is someone who you will never meet, called a reader. You are not writing to impress the scientist you've just interviewed, nor the professor who got you through your degree. You are writing to impress someone sitting on a train who will stop reading in a fifth of a second, given a chance. So the first sentence you write will be the most important sentence of your life, and so will the second and the third. This is because although you may feel obliged to write, nobody has ever felt obliged to read it. So for a national newspaper, most of the readers are not scientists. So science stories are often written at a level that will be understood by a bright 14 or maybe 15-year-old. On a tabloid, that age is 11. At a publication like Nature, we write at a level that can be understood by someone who studied high school science up to the age of 17 or 18. And we pick this age because although most of our readers are working scientists, they might be ecologists reading about cosmology or astronomers reading about genetics. So our coverage has to be meaningful, important, accurate, and insightful for people who are world experts in the topic we're covering. But it also has to be accessible enough so that any scientifically literate person can read it. So what is the point of science journalism? Well, for any commercial publication, part of the reason is bluntly to sell newspapers or magazine subscriptions. But there are nobler purposes. Maybe you just want to shout from the rooftops about an amazing new discovery. Maybe you want to make it easier for scientists from diverse disciplines to communicate and collaborate with each other. Maybe you want to expose wrongdoing in the scientific community. Maybe you want to highlight deficiencies in science funding. Maybe you want to shine a light on a fascinating academic dispute in a way that might actually help to resolve it and enable science to progress. These reasons, all of them and more, all motivate journalists at Nature. So back in 2009, Nature did a special issue about science journalism, and the editorial in that issue was headlined with a question: cheerleader or watchdog? And clearly the answer is that journalism at Nature is a bit of both. So what does that actually look like in detail? What does a reporter at Nature do all day? Well, first, they look for a story. It might be a straightforward story about a new scientific discovery, and they might find that in a press release that's come into their email inbox or that's been posted to a media website such as Eureka Alert. It's a special service run by the AAAS in the US. Eureka Alert hosts press releases under embargo so that they're only visible to registered journalists. And these press releases often say things like, researchers in the University of Utopia have discovered a way to achieve faster than light travel, reverse global warming, and cure all forms of cancer. The paper will be published next Thursday in the Journal of frankly astonishing results. The press release is going to be about 500 words long. It will contain a few quotes from the researcher, maybe an image or two that are free to use by journalists in their publications, contact details for the researchers involved, and so on. So in mainstream media, a lot of newspapers, some journalists will take that text, adapt it a little bit, not ask too many questions, and that's pretty much all they do to prepare their story. Others will actually pick up the phone and talk to the lead scientist. So you've really cured all forms of cancer with faster than light travel. Some will even talk to an outside source. That's someone who's an expert in the field, but not actually involved in that particular piece of research. And that's so that they can offer a very informal kind of peer review, really. Does this sound credible? Does this sound like it might be useful? But at Nature, journalists take this press release and that level of report, that's just a starting point. It's just a flag for some new and potentially interesting science. The reporter should have the expertise to know how this result sits in the broader context of the field, whether it's likely to be controversial or disputed or hyped up to high heaven. And they'll also have a sense about what the future implications of the research might be. Press releases aren't the only starting point for a story, though. We are not only spoon-fed this stuff by press officers. Journalists at Nature will have a beat. That's a set of topics that they cover regularly. And so they will be scanning the major journals in those areas to keep up with the literature, to find new ideas for stories. Or we might be contacted directly by researchers who let us know that they have a new paper coming out. But however they arrive at it, this potential story, if the paper sounds like something the readers would find interesting and important, the reporter then goes to their editor and spends a few minutes pitching the story. That means explaining what it's about and why we should cover it. The editor loves it. She wants 600 words, including a couple of quotes from interviews with one of the lead researchers and a couple of outside sources commenting on it as well. So you quickly read the paper in more detail and approach all of those potential sources, which is done mostly by email these days, but it can happen by socials, maybe just by phoning them up directly. The interviews take 10 to 20 minutes each, usually on a news story. Then you write it up, you write the whole story, including relevant web links, references, suggested images, and file it to your editor. The editor then finds ways to improve the story. They might make it more concise, remove jargon, change the order that you lay out certain chunks of information to make it more digestible for the reader. They will also ask you a lot of questions. Why didn't the scientists do it this way instead? Why had nobody thought of doing it this way before? These two sources seem to contradict each other, so who's right? So as a reporter, you deal with the questions, sometimes by going back to the people you interviewed to clarify things. Then the story goes to a sub-editor who checks the facts, makes sure the story is in house style, all neat and tidy. They, the sub-editor, will probably ask more questions as well. And once all that is resolved, it's ready to publish. Now that whole process, some of these stories are turned around in 24 hours. Sometimes they might spread over a few days alongside other work, but the amount of time that I as a reporter would put into a typical story like that is somewhere in the region of 8 hours, something like that, for Nature at least. Other magazines, because of the requirements are different, it might happen more quickly. For longer feature stories, which are about 2,500 words and maybe span over 3 or 4 print magazine pages, that might take several weeks of work, maybe even a reporting trip to an exotic location if you're lucky. But feature stories aren't necessarily about something that's happening now. This paper has just been published. They're often more about longer term trends, people who are doing interesting things, people who are changing the direction of their field and so on. So what types of stories are the editors who commission reporters to do this? What types of stories are they looking for at Nature? So I think the news stories at Nature broadly fall into 4 categories. The first I've just described to you, it's a straight science story. Here's a discovery. Second category is a community story, stuff that's actually happening to people in the scientific community. Often journalists find these stories because they've got really good contacts with people in that field. They might meet up at conferences to catch up. They might email about each other about issues in their field. And it's very much a symbiotic relationship, right? The journalist hears about things that the journalist hears about things that scientists are concerned about that might make stories. The scientist gets to flag issues that would benefit, they believe, from wider scrutiny. So the third type of story is a policy story, something connected with government policy. It might be a new policy that affects science. It might be about how science is informing a government policy. And the final category I call behind the headlines. And that often looks in depth, certainly in more scientific depth, at something that's being covered in the mainstream media. Tone here is really didactic. For example, countries are cracking down on tobacco use and vaping. Here's the evidence on how many lives it could save, how much money it could save. Now, there are 3 main news editors at Nature who commission these stories, and they cover specific regions: Europe, Americas, Asia Pacific. These days, all the news goes online first, and then the stories that are more popular based on web traffic or believed to be especially important by the editors are recycled into the print edition. That is actually one of the biggest changes from when I started at Nature 20 years ago, because the online and print news teams were entirely separate back then. You had an entirely different team working on online news versus print news. As a freelancer, I get to pitch to lots of different editors, not just those at Nature. So if a story is a really nice bit of chemistry that will be fascinating for chemists, but not really of wider interest for people outside that community, I can pitch it to Chemical and Engineering News. And because I've been in the business for 20 years, I know a lot of editors. That means the editors often come to me with a story idea and ask if I can cover it for them. Maybe this is something that's been suggested by a staff reporter who is tied up on another story, maybe even suggested actually by a journal editor like Nina, which sometimes happens at Nature. Maybe they just need someone in my time zone or with my particular expertise. But whatever the reason, more than half of my writing work comes in that way. I don't have to proactively pitch it. It comes directly from editors to me. So I've been talking a lot about news and features. They're certainly at the heart of Nature's journalism, but there are also editorials, opinion pieces written by people in-house in the journal. There are research highlights, opinion pieces, and news and views articles that are written by scientists but edited by journalists. They offer a perspective on a hot new paper, often one that's being published in Nature. Collectively, all of these sections make up the front half. I'm learning just now that we're not meant to call it that anymore, but that's what it's always been called, and I'm going to keep calling it that. These all make up the front half of Nature, the so-called magazine section. I don't have a copy of Nature with me, but if you imagine the magazine of Nature, this bit, the front half, is all the journalism stuff. This bit, the back bit, is all the published, peer-reviewed academic articles. Nature really prides itself actually on the fact that the front half, the journalism, is editorially independent from the back half. What that means in practice is that we can report on controversies about Nature papers without being influenced by the manuscript editors or by other parts of the academic publishing business. Just think about the fuss over the Rangadias hydride superconductor scandal. It's a perfect example, actually. Right, so why would you care about any of this? Well, a few of you might have ambitions to be a science journalist, and I'm happy to talk to you afterwards in more detail about how you might go about following that career path. One of the broader reasons, though, why you might be interested in science journalism is that it is highly likely that sooner or later you will find yourself being contacted by a science journalist for an interview. It might be about your own work, comment on someone else's work, or something that's going on in academia. When a journalist contacts you, I would urge you to engage with them. It's not only a way to make yourself and your work known to the wider scientific community, it's crucial to help that journalist get the facts right about what they're writing. I've also had scientists tell me that the discussions we've had during an interview has actually sparked new ideas for research directions, or the story has prompted new collaborations. Some scientists use news stories about their work to support grant applications or tenure applications as a way to demonstrate impact of their work, broader impact. And talking to journalists really just forms part of a broader class of academic work. It's often dubbed outreach, which these days can actually be a requirement of a lot of funding agencies. Now, I know some scientists can be quite suspicious of journalists. They assume they're trying to catch them out or get them to say something controversial. In the vast majority of cases, that is not true. And if the journalist works for a science-focused, reputable organization like Nature or Scientific American, I'd say it's essentially never the case. We just want to write a true and interesting story for our readers. And also, just ignoring a journalist's interview request doesn't mean they won't write the story. It's already been commissioned. They're writing that story, whether you engage with them or not. So really, if you can spare 10 or 15 minutes, it's always better to engage with them if you can, because you can help to shape the tone of the story and make sure that it accurately represents your field. So let's talk about your field, which I think has some specific challenges for journalists covering your area, especially for mainstream journalists. If you look at materials science, for example, any story about a new discovery will inevitably ask, what is it good for? Is this material going to be a better catalyst or an amazing battery electrode component? What are the applications? And the truth is, with a lot of basic research, often we don't really know whether it's going to be practically useful for anything, because that depends on so many other factors beyond its physical properties, the availability of the materials, the cost, incumbent technologies that are already on the market, and so on. So there's always a risk, I think, for scientists and journalists of overhyping materials science discoveries. Just think of how often you've heard graphene or perovskite photovoltaics described as a miracle material. My advice is to be clear about what properties it has that might be exploited in applications, but also be clear about what hurdles might have to be overcome to achieve that. That way the journalist is more likely to write a nuanced story that accurately reflects the true situation with all the necessary caveats. Another issue for your area is about the computer side of things, modeling, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. Almost every journalist you ever talk to will treat these things as a black box. They don't understand it. They don't care what's going on inside the algorithms. At best, they want to know what you fed into it and what came out the other side. Now, on the one hand, this is entirely understandable. Most of the journalist readers are simply not interested in the inner workings of an algorithm or a modeling system. And since it's not going in the story, the reporter doesn't need to ask you about it. But on the other hand, I do worry that too much of this stuff is now being taken on trust by journalists. As a journalist, you have essentially almost no way of telling whether this or that AI system is indeed producing meaningful and useful results, or of comparing different AI approaches. And since AI is now being used more and more in research, I think this sort of black boxing problem is only going to get worse. So I think it would be helpful for you as a community to start to think about ways to explain what's going on inside the black box, models, simulations, algorithms, maybe by thinking of helpful metaphors or analogies so that those sorts of details can start to creep into broader media coverage of your work. If you haven't seen it, I just found this comic when I came in here in a stack over there, which I think is a really good example of how you can use metaphors and storytelling to explain relatively complex ideas about simulation and modeling. So if you haven't got a copy, go and have a look. They're in a pile over by the door. And I think this is important to try and explain this stuff because it's not just about fostering a deeper understanding of your work, valuable though that is. I think it's also an important way to demonstrate transparency about your work, and transparency tends to engender trust and support. So I want to wrap this up by looking at how science journalism is changing. First, let's look at the technology side. Like I've already explained, Nature is now an online-first magazine, and that's true for the vast majority of mainstream and specialist magazines out there. But there is also a lot more technology used in the newsroom. 10 years ago, I used to have daily in-person news meetings every morning to hear reporters' pitches and decide the day's news agenda. Now, a lot of that collaborative work is done remotely using systems like Slack and Trello. The editors use systems like Chartbeat to see what stories are resonating most with readers to help decide what will go into print. Since about 2020, the editors have also had story traffic goals. So they really do like to pick hot topics that are going to get a lot of readers' eyes on page. In general, Cool New Science does get a lot more clicks than climate policy, but it's obviously important to cover both areas. It's just one example there where an editor's commissioning judgment is really important to get the right balance of stories. Social media is obviously used more and more to drive traffic to magazine websites, but it can also play a big role in commissioning decisions. If a topic generates a lot of discussion on Twitter, like the supposed room temperature superconductor LK99, for example, you can visibly see that it's something the community is interested in. So Nature and science journalists more generally want to play a role in that conversation and bring it to the fore. On the community side, representation has rightly become a much bigger issue for science journalists over the past 10, 20 years. Women in science has been a perennial topic much longer, of course, but diversity, equity, and inclusion more generally really is at the forefront of a lot of journalists' thinking these days. So let me give you an example. Some of you might have heard of a science writer called Ed Yong, who's written books like I Contain Multitudes, which is about the microbiome. He was a staff writer at The Atlantic for several years. He's also written for Nature in the past. About 10 years ago, Ed started looking in detail at the gender ratios of scientists quoted in his stories. And he found that on average, women were really underrepresented. Some of the stories looked like those dreaded all-male conference panels, the manels. Around the same time, other journalists and publications started doing similar surveys, and it really highlighted that this was a widespread problem. It prompted, I think, a genuine rethink in science journalism, and since then, most of the magazines I work for explicitly ask reporters to find diverse sources for their story. More women, more people of colour, more LGBTQ scientists, and so on. Broadly, I would say that effort is working, but slowly, and there is clearly a long way to go. One of the most helpful things for journalists who are trying to take action on this issue are online resources that act as directories for scientists who are from underrepresented groups. These are sites such as Diverse Sources, Gauge, Diversify Chemistry, and many more. I would encourage researchers to sign up to these kinds of directories because I know that journalists really use them, me and many others. It's also important that we hear more from young scientists, the people who actually do the lab work, who are very well represented here. I often try to interview the PhDs or postdocs who led the experimental work on a paper, but often they will defer to their boss, or their boss won't let them do the interview. I say, let us hear the voices of young scientists because they're the future of your field. They're also the best recruiting tool for the next generation of scientists. If you're a young scientist and you're nervous about doing an interview, ask your institution's press officer for some media training because most of them will be able to provide that. So the shift to online that I've been talking about over the past 20 years, it certainly made science journalism more visible and more interactive with its readers, but it also means that the money that magazines make from print advertising has gone down significantly, while the income that you get from online advertising has not risen enough to take its place. Nature's journalism, fortunately, is somewhat insulated from that because it's always been regarded as a loss leader. It is added value in the journal that helps to retain subscriptions, but it does not have to make a profit on its own. But elsewhere, science journalism is really suffering from the decline in advertising revenues. National Geographic laid off all its staff reporters last year. Popular Science stopped publishing its physical magazine, which had existed for 150 years, and with it went a lot of staff jobs. Wired laid off 20 staff journalists last year, and so on. Clearly, this is a problem for my profession, but I think it's a problem for scientists too, because without specialist science journalists, the quality of coverage of your field will decline, or it might disappear altogether. And that leaves a big gap where disinformation about science can flourish. There's a danger that all this has the knock-on effect of damaging public trust in science, which is bad for all of us. Just look at the growth in anti-vaccine rhetoric online. So once again, I urge you to engage with science journalism as a reader, as a source, or as a contributor. I know it can sometimes seem like science and the media are in opposition. That journalist took my quote out of context. They hyped those dubious results. It's all fake news. So I want to end with an observation from that Nature editorial that I mentioned earlier about science and the media. Here's what it said. Science and journalism are not alien cultures. They are built on the same foundation, the belief that conclusions require evidence, that the evidence should be open to everyone, and that everything is subject to question. Both groups are comprised of professional skeptics. So here's to professional skepticism, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was quick, but I mean surprisingly overview of what science journalism is and what is it for. Just a quick note, because Mark mentioned it really quickly. If you haven't, and if you have a chance to, do read the coverage of the Nature News team of the high temperature superconductivity affair, because it's really an incredible, I think, case history of the two different roles of the independence of the two teams, and Nature in particular, but in general, of science journalism versus journal editing, an impressive series of stories actually, where the Nature News team really looked critically into what had gone wrong with the peer review of those two retracted papers, including revealing details that probably the journal team didn't necessarily want to be revealed, and asking uncomfortable questions up to Magdalena Skipper, the editor-in-chief of Nature. So it was really quite impressive for me to read, and it's also fun to read that if you're interested about science. So do read it. I know we have a couple of questions but again, maybe before let's hear from the room. Otherwise, there are actually two intriguing questions from online. Yeah.
So the first one is about the art that comes with papers. And so are there any professional science artists that you work with? Or do you create the images, animations yourself?
I certainly don't have the skills to create it myself, to create things like that myself. There is a whole ecosystem of people who work in scientific design, scientific graphic design. Some of them will work on staff at Nature. I think their art desk for Nature is probably about half a dozen people, something like that. They'll also have 2 or 3 or perhaps even 4 these days, picture editors who will go out and find pictures. But in terms of creating scientific graphics, yeah, Nature has a team of people, and it also has freelancers who it will use for that. A lot of the covers actually are often done by freelancers who are really genuinely artists in their own right, digital artists, but also highly scientifically literate, so that they can take concepts and ideas from a paper and turn it into beautiful images for the cover, or indeed to accompany these views and things like that.
This is maybe both for both of you, but because I've had, for the covers, for example, I've had scientist friends asking me, oh, they told us that our paper might be the cover of the next issue. Can I teach a design for the cover of Nature, or will they do it on their own? So can scientists propose their own cover, or will it?
I don't actually know for Nature. I think Nature does most of them themselves.
I
We use so all the Nature subjournals largely work with suggestions we get from authors. Although it's worth noting that each of the journals has a particular style. So like Nature Physics, for example, likes covers that are based on data in some shape or form. But we still get a lot of suggestions that are these 3D renderings that you see on a lot of journal covers. So people don't necessarily look at what you're doing. But we usually get them before we pick what we do. So we pick based on the design. So just in case anybody was planning to do that, or rather their bosses were planning to, I know a lot of people who actually spend thousands of euros or whatever currency to pay people to produce these cover suggestions before they even know it will be used. I suggest don't. We do have a professional art editor who I happen to know ours very well. She actually studied medical design, I think. So you can also study these things. They are real professionals in that regard. And what she's done with some suggestions and covers is mind-blowing. So don't pay that much money. If you could get it for £50, fine, but don't pay thousands of francs, euros, whatever.
You have another question? It's about
Second question is, when you are considering whether to write about a published study, what role does the impact factor of the journal or other journal metrics criteria play in your decision?
reputation or impact factor or metric about the job?
Impact factor doesn't play any factor at all, because I don't pay attention to that. I mean, I genuinely couldn't tell you what impact factors of journals are, but I do have a sense of where high impact science is likely to be covered. In chemistry, Nature, not so much actually in chemistry, but science, JACS, Angevanta, places like that. And it's those sorts of journals that I'm looking at when I'm doing journal trawling. But I think the other factor as well is I've mentioned one of the ways that science comes under journalists' noses is via press releases. And Nature and Science and some of the Cell journals like M and things like that do put out weekly press releases that say, here are the most exciting papers we're going to be publishing. And the Nature press release and the Science press release are probably the biggest feeders of science journalism, certainly in the mainstream media, but actually also in the specialist media. I've on occasion had scientists moaning to me, why do you only ever write about stuff in Science or Nature? Well, it's because it's so readily available. It's being provided to you. You get that press release in your inbox at the same time every week, and they've got little summaries of what they think the top 4 papers are that are coming out next week, give you an alert about that, and it gives you a few days to get the paper, get the interviews in place, so it's all ready to go when the embargo lifts. It makes it easy for you. And for a lot of journalists, especially in mainstream publications, making things easier means you can produce more copy, and editors like that, because rather than spending 2 days to write a story, you can spend 1 day to write 2 stories, so they're getting more words out.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I suggest that we take a very short break just to stretch our legs, and then we'll be back for the discussion with both Nina and Mark in 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll now take some time for a discussion, which means not only that I'm sitting here in the middle of Mark and Nina will try to chat, the 3 of us, but let's try to make this really a discussion. So please, whenever you have curiosity for them to expand a specific point or, a question that came up during that, please interrupt me in particular, and jump in. I would like to start with a very direct question, which we didn't even agreed upon beforehand, so those are the best ones, because you've both described very well, I think, in what your job is about, your own motivations for going into it, and some of the challenges, but there are probably many more, but some of the challenges that it's now facing. The very direct question is, would you advise someone who is now a young student, who is now training in their own specific field, to consider your career? Is this something that, in your opinion, with all that's changing in the business, is a good path to go for someone who is, who has some interest maybe in the communication aspect, in the writing aspect, as you, for example, Nina described, that you kind of had that bug early on. Would you recommend it to young people now? Because the answer is not necessarily yes.
I think in principle I would, but I think you need to be clear what the job actually is, because it's not a science journalist job. So if you want to spend your day writing, editor is probably not the first choice of job. I think editor is a good thing, a good job if you described it quite nicely with Stu's motivation when we were chatting earlier. If you want to stay with science, but not necessarily be a practicing researcher, because you do still get all the trends, everything that's happening, all the interactions with researchers. You still have to handle a lot of papers, but you also need an interest in that communications aspect, at least. Depends a little bit what journal you're working at. I had to do a lot less of that at Nature Communications. So there are many, many journals where you can be close to science as an editor without any of the journalistic-y things. But it's also, you also have to be aware it's not the easiest job in the world. So some of the things I didn't talk about earlier is that it's not a 9-to-5 job. I frankly work more now than I did as a PhD student. I never worked a weekend during my PhD, for example. Sometimes I do now because I have to meet deadlines. If they're on a Monday and I'm not finished, Sunday's the day to do it. So we are quite busy. It's a lot of time management that you have to do to juggle 50 things at once, because you're not just working on one project, you're working on 5 or 6 at the same time, and they're not done in a day. So you have to be aware of those things. You also need quite a level of people skills, because not everybody's happy with the decisions I make about their papers. Most people are, at least in physics, most people are quite polite, but they do come back with emails saying, no, I think you were wrong and here is why. I thankfully have had very little of that. Some of these emails can get nasty, and you kind of have to deal with that. It's quite rare, thankfully, that people, one of my colleagues back at NatComs, I remember at the time, had a wonderful email that started with, I understand that you're a failed scientist, but. Again, these things are rare, but even if that happens once every 6 months, it can weigh on you,
You have to
especially
put up with it.
if it comes at a point where you're, because they don't know if your dog died the day before, this is not what you want to deal with, but you kind of have to. So and you still have to reply in a professional way. You can't just go, well, sort off, you idiot. So you need a level of people skills. And one thing we hear a lot in interviews, I think every single person I've interviewed who actually was viable as an editorial candidate, including myself, has said this. One of the main motivations for a lot of people to leave the lab and become editors is that they get essentially bored with just looking at a tiny section of science. Especially as a PhD student and postdoc, you kind of become the world expert in this teeny tiny area. Whereas my job, I often say, and I think Mark's probably similar, that I often say that I'm a professional non-specialist. So I kind of have to know all the optics in breadth, but only yay deep. So it's quite different. But if those are things that bug you about your current job, you might be interested. Then, no, I mean, if things like just this tiny area of physics bugs you, then editorial is definitely an option. But there are downsides to it, of course, and it is becoming more stressful with the open access transition. Like I said, AI is looming, that certain things that you might enjoy might be taken away, like research highlight writing might be automated in 5 years' time, I don't know, or even in 2. So things are changing, just be aware of that, but I still think it's a good job. In principle, I like my job. I've just been doing it for a long time, so I'm at a stage again where I get a little bored, but that's just me, that's got nothing to do with the job.
Mark, for journalists, it has become harder and harder the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
Shrinking newsrooms, shrinking budgets.
True.
I mean, you became a freelance by choice, but many people out there just can't find jobs and maybe don't have the options that you have as a freelancer.
Yeah.
With all your content. So would you still recommend going into science journalism to a
Yeah.
young?
100%. It's an absolutely brilliant job. It's the most fun you can have. It's amazing. So I finished my postdoc, and really I wanted to be the eternal student. I really wanted to just be a student for the rest of my life. I didn't want the responsibility of running a research group. I didn't want the responsibility of having to, come up with research proposals and win grant funding. Oh, good Lord. I enjoyed the lab work. I was good at making air-sensitive reactions work. That was what I was good at. That's what I enjoyed. And I also really enjoyed talking about the work and learning about a really wide, diverse range of sciences. So the job that I have, the jobs that I've done over my career have all contained that core element. I get to learn about science. When you do an interview as a science journalist, especially if you're writing for a relatively specialist publication like Nature or Chemical and Engineering News, the level that you're doing the interview at with the scientist on the phone or on Zoom, it's like you're a first or maybe second year undergraduate in a tutorial, a one-to-one tutorial. Sometimes for a feature interview, you might have set aside half an hour to talk to that person. What an incredible privilege to get to do that on a regular basis of just contacting people and saying, I'm writing about your area of work. I want to talk to you about it for half an hour. Will you give me half an hour of your time? Now, clearly you've prepped, you have a bunch of questions you want to ask them about, but it's just brilliant. And I'm getting paid to do it. So yeah, I thoroughly recommend it. I think it's great. Yeah, there are some issues in the business. There is the threat that journalists are going to be replaced by AI. In fact, AI already writes a lot of the financial news that we read. Bloomberg has been using automated algorithms to write a lot of basic market stories for years. I think specialist science journalism, I would say, probably going to be the last thing that's automated in AI. I would like, there's a prediction, but that's my hunch, because it requires a really broad understanding of the field. It requires interviews to be able to supply the context and the nuance that it needs to be actually credible by experts in the field. Very hard to simulate that stuff, I suspect. There you go for it.
Good. Yep, one question.
Talking about AI, do you take as an editor special investigation towards whether a paper is written by AI or not? Because there are certain fields where this is a major problem, and very new PhD students are in your work based on a paper that was written by AI, like really invented, not just text was written, but it was invented by AI. Then you find out it doesn't work. That's kind of frustrating. Do you take special care of that?
It is. We don't have the screening processes yet. I know there are in the works. We do have automated screening, of course, for plagiarism, because those tools exist. There just aren't any reliable tools for AI yet, but our research integrity team is working on them. So for now, we don't. I think at least for our level of selectivity, it's probably safe to say that we would most likely not send those out to review. Because very often they're also very weird. Well, first of all, you do start to recognize the style of writing. We have had it on the team a few weeks ago that one of my colleagues had a paper where 3 or 4 references were clearly non-existent. So you check these things and you then go and investigate with the authors. But it's also so far most of the AI written papers are very sort of formulaic. Oh, here's another whatever synthesis of hundredth time of the same thing, kind of. They're not quite at the originality level that we're looking for. So for us specifically, it hasn't been a problem yet. I know that there are published papers out there. So not to get into paper mills and all this stuff, that there are people who pay for these things to happen and to be published. But no, tools are on the way, but we don't have them yet for a standard check. I'm getting better at recognizing AI images, I can tell you that. That's just a life skill at this point in time.
Well, in the journalistic field, I don't think that there is that kind of problem, because honestly, you can't tell. But on the other hand, I mean, I think we can say we know that for a fact that, for example, Nature is beginning to experiment with some AI-generated short stories, like the Research Highlights, those kind of stuff. I've seen a few of them myself. They require massive work from the editor to be made presentable. So I agree with you that they don't present a threat.
I didn't know that. I didn't know they were testing out doing.
If you look not in Nature itself, but in some of the related titles, and I can point
even in Nature,
you can find the sort of byline. This text was partially generated by ChatGPT.
It's definitely on the Research Highlights. Definitely, there have been some published with AI assistance. I think we've published entire AI written books. That's the spring end of those. But of course, like you say, there's a lot of editorial input. But the development is happening. That's why I'm saying I don't know if in 3 years' time, highlights will still be written by us in-house.
Yeah. So it's happening, but
So I have a question. So Nina, you had this list of kind of the history of scientific publishing, and kind of if we look at the history where peer review was only introduced in the like commonplace in the 70s, for example, in Nature. And I've seen some people kind of argue that not every paper needs to be reviewed now because we publish so many papers that basically this whole system has a very hard time scaling. We know that publishing, like especially if one looks, right, we have the number now, costs between $12,000 to have a paper as open access in Nature. So we know the whole system is quite expensive. So I'm wondering kind of what other forms we scientific publishing could have where we still have editors, but maybe fewer of them review all papers.
I told you. Expect at least one question about the crisis of peer review.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. Speaking personally, that is not in the capacity of my company because they probably have different views on this. I personally agree that not every paper necessarily needs to be peer reviewed. Probably. There is, however, a general perception, and I think you will also have views on this from the journalistic side, that the peer review, just like publication in certain journals, just comes with a stamp of approval of this has been checked. And a lot of people now would not take a paper seriously anymore if it wasn't peer reviewed. I mean, one thing that already exists, but I'm not sure everybody is aware of, is our archive overlay journals. So it basically works like this: you put your paper on the archive. There are a handful of editors. I don't think they're professional editors necessarily, but people who run an overlay journal like Quantum, that's probably the most successful one, who then decide, okay, within the Quantum part of archive, these are papers that I would be interested in, and they then perform a level of peer review. There are also some journals in my area, for example, Optica, who have a specific type of article. They call it a memorandum. It's a very short kind of, this is the latest thing I've done, that isn't formally peer reviewed, but they have academic editors. So they have people who also work in that field. So say you're the editor of a computational materials journal, and you get a 2-page paper, they're very short things, then it's your responsibility, in this case for the memorandum, to say, okay, from what I can see, this is technically correct, and we'll publish this without further peer review. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable doing that because I'm not expert enough in the things that I look at to say they're right or wrong. There are experiments internally, and I'm sure other publishers do them as well, looking into whether one can use systems like AI to assist review, not to replace it, but at least to assist it, so it's not quite as onerous for peer reviewers, so it doesn't take quite as much time. But who knows where that's going. At the end of the day, I think that will be more of a community decision rather than a publishing industry decision. If people truly believe that certain papers don't need to be peer reviewed, put it on a preprint, don't submit it to a journal. If you don't want it peer reviewed, you don't have to have it peer reviewed. Then again, your funders probably won't accept it, and the people who make decisions on careers probably won't accept it. But once you've got tenure, you can do what you like as long as it doesn't affect your students. So there are all these incentive things to just de-incentivize not peer reviewing at the moment.
Mark, what's your take on this? Because also for journalists, this is changing a lot. I mean, 10 years ago, probably, or not more than that, most journalists wouldn't consider non-peer-reviewed articles as a source unless they were really exceptional. Now, and during the pandemic, this has grown a lot, right? Because a lot of important research was coming out in preprint. Now it's quite common, even in publications like Nature itself, The Economist, etc., to see preprints treated as news material.
Yeah.
And one can also argue that makes the role of science journalists even more key, because then you become the one who has to call the right experts, hear what they think. So It's an interesting turn of events for
You
science
have
journalists.
to, when you're dealing with papers on the archive or Chem archive or whatever, you have to be more aware that this is not done for peer review. You tend to be more diligent about your outside sources to get comment and to get that kind of peer review about that work. So generally my rule of thumb, if I'm writing primarily about it, so if the primary focus of the story is a preprint, I just add one outside source more than I ordinarily would do in another news story. It's a very rough rule of thumb, I'm not saying it's perfect, there you go. But there are some fields where publishing, where they're fast moving and publishing on an archive is so common within that field that you pretty much have to cover that stuff. So I recently did a kind of a wrap up article, not breaking any new ground, but just giving an overview of all of the superconductor turmoil of last year, Diaz, LK99, things like that. And lots of the key stuff on all sides, reputation, checking the theoretical stuff, practical references, it's all on archive. So you really just have to go in and delve into that and say, okay, this is what these people have reported. Now here's what these people say about these papers. So you have people commenting directly on this archive, that archive paper, as you're going along in the story. It does make me more cautious. I mean, I think the only things where I can only think of a couple of stories where I have pitched a story based entirely on one preprint, and those were both in areas of chemistry that I know really well enough to dig in and go, this is totally credible. These guys who did this, that's a credible team. This is great. And off you go. But most of it, I'm pretty leery of this.
Can I just ask a question to Mark, because I'm less familiar with the more modern archive offshoots. I know that some of them have commenting options, as the traditional archive doesn't. Do you take those into account when you see them, or do you just use them as potential sources?
If I ever see them, I'm more likely to find sources for comment on preprint. Actually, the way that works, which is to see if I already know who else works in that field, see other key people that they've cited, other references, see who's excited and commenting about it on Twitter. It's that stuff. I can't think about any use of comments on preprints in that way.
I was just thinking, because that sort of having a commenting sort of post-publication peer review on preprints would be one option to that level of review without formal.
The thing is, especially in chemistry, I think chemistry is probably the slowest scientists to move over to using preprints, things like that. So it still isn't a big part of the chemistry world.
Yeah, one question there.
So I actually find this interesting concerning this discussion also about preprints and sorry, my voice is a bit and publications in high-profile journals. So about the soundness of the kind of stories that one can write as a science journalist, because so the original question I wanted to ask is: do you think there's a effect of dilution where there's a big base of research, and then the higher one goes in the hierarchy of the publishing, the more one comes into things which are, more and more a bit hyped up, things are being done such that they look fancy and so on. And then there's the press release, which again drops a bit of the, maybe important context and so on. So that there's this kind of dilution effect of what is actually has happened. And would you think that if you are now instead searching for the story on archive and talking to, not the big shot professor, but to some random researchers, that it may actually be good for the soundness of the stories that are written?
It's interesting. I think part of that makes the assumption that if it is in a high-profile journal, it's been accompanied by the press release, the journalist will take the way that they present those results at face value. So even if I'm writing a story about a Nature paper, I will not assume that all claims are true. So claims of priority, for example, the first time that we've ever done this. So I wrote about Goldie weeks ago, which is like graphene, but made out of gold. 1 atom thin sheets made out of gold. There you go. And the press release was like, nobody's ever made this before. And the paper, the abstract, nobody's ever made it before. We dig in and reference 34 is some people have claimed to make this before, but we don't think they actually made it. But you look at that paper and they definitely thought they made it. So there's a key issue there to explore, which none of the other coverage I saw explored that. This is a good example of why it's so important to talk to journalists. I tried all sorts of ways to try and talk to that original research team. And nobody answered my calls, my phone messages, my emails, my social contacts, anything. So I couldn't put their point of view on this. So it has to be, you know, some people have claimed this before, the current researchers dispute that. There you go, that's all you can do. But my God, I wish I'd been able to get hold of them and ask them about this stuff. Sorry, I rambled there and diverted. I think the point is a decent journalist should be skeptical about everything, whatever journal it's published in, whatever the impact factor and stuff.
It's another question there.
So I have a question a bit related to the equivalent of the archives, but for journalism, there could be blogs where people come and write on any topic that they want, and that sometimes might be reflecting and conveying personal opinions, which I think in normal news outlet, we would know if a journal is for the like climate-sceptic, or we would have, as a society, we would know those type of opinions. And so, in your opinion, how do we control better those blogs where everyone can write about anything and make it sound as if it is a widely accepted opinion when it's actually only a small group that thinks that?
Well, I mean, you certainly can't stop people writing stuff on the internet. I mean, that's
We can't stop it. So how do we make sure that people don't believe in?
How do you stop it? Okay, so there's two different ways. Make it clear what outlets like Nature or New Scientist or whoever, what value they are adding, professional skepticism, right? That they are checking this stuff. And on the other hand, I would also say, it's basic critical thinking to look at any piece of writing anywhere, online, in a book, in print, and apply basic critical thinking to it to say, why are they telling me this? Do they have a vested interest in making me think one thing or another? All of that stuff. And that starts at school. It starts with parents in the home. It starts with, in Britain, there's always a furor whenever anybody suggests that kids at school are mandatorily made to study media studies because it's seen as a fake subject, a made-up subject, some fancy, trendy thing. I think media studies is possibly one of the most important things that we could teach teenagers, just to try and understand how the media works, why they might be trying to shape your opinions in certain ways, and so on.
Well, Nature, a couple of issues ago, I think, published a study on the dynamics of circulation of information on social network by an Italian team, which was quite interesting because it was not what you would have considered hard science or nature material some years ago. It was media studies, actually. So I think we probably have some questions from online as well, Sarah.
We have several, and it's also going to be tough for me to just read these questions because I have a few myself, but okay. So the first one is, the emphasis on high impact research can come at the expense of robust incremental science. However, it seems as though journals will always want to use impact as a metric to judge papers because impact equals engagement. And so what are journals doing or should be doing to try to encourage the robustness of science rather than simply seeking clicks?
3 questions at once. Right. Where am I going to start? First of all, it's not every journal that looks for impact. There are a lot of sound science journals out there I mean, Scientific Reports is probably still the biggest. There are PLOS One, I think, is one as well. There are quite a few of them out there, usually referred to as mega journals, where all that matters is whether the paper is deemed correct by peer review and not whether it's interesting or new or impactful or anything. So it's not every journal. The Nature journals and some others, Science and Cell, they are all very much about we want the most impactful things. Because again, we can publish 200, well, Nature Physics can publish 200 papers a year. We want them to actually make a splash. When I at least talk about impact, I don't mean clicks. I mean the things that I said earlier, that they impact the community, the research community in some way. That of course means the paper is read usually, but those clicks, sometimes they only happen 5 years later. So it's not about clickbait in that sense, it's about impacting the community. And I think there is a lot of space in the world for both types of journal, but I also think it's in a way quite good to keep them more or less separate, because these, let's say, 50 important papers in a year, they will just be drowned out in a publication of millions and millions, and they're very hard to find if you don't know where to look. That's not to say that mega journals don't also sometimes publish immensely important research. There was another thing about robustness. Just because we're looking for impact doesn't mean we're not expecting our papers to be robust. They still have to be. They have to go through the same peer review process and from one journal to another. I can tell you that the peer review reports that I get at Nature Physics are actually more critical and more thorough than the ones I got at Nature Communications. So I'm assuming if you go to journals like Scientific Reports, their reports are probably even less detailed than what I get now. So it's still quite a rigorous process. And we do for physics, not yet, but for the life sciences, where there is a lot of statistics and all these sort of the things that often lead to, let's say, misinterpretations, whether they are accidental or not. We do have criteria what they need to show and how they need to present them, and we check for these things. And we are officially on the record with an opinion piece from a few years ago that people should stop hyping their research and instead go with the simplest explanation if possible. We'd actually welcome that as editors. That's not to say people will stop doing it.
Yeah. So one more, this one is from Mark. How are achievements measured in scientific journalism? What are the milestones that accompany such a profession? For researchers, for example, our progress and achievements are predicated on publications. Does that carry over in any way? And then thank you for the talks and discussions, both.
It's really interesting. What are the achievements and milestones? I suppose prizes and awards are one obvious way to do that. So there are, as well as your general journalism awards like Pulitzer prizes, there are several, more than several, lots of prizes and awards connected with science journalism. The AAAS runs one, the Association of British Science Writers runs one. I think there's an equivalent European Science Journalism Association, and many more. So this is one way to recognise people. They're like the Oscars of the science journalism world. On a very brutal day-to-day level, some publications really will monitor how many readers, how many clicks your stories will get, which may affect future commissioning decisions. I mean, in a sense, there's also your progression through the industry. You start off as a lowly general assignment reporter. You might, get senior in front of your title. You might become an editor. You might become a senior, and so on and so on. But it is actually remarkably common for people to come out the other end of that, like me, who've risen to a certain level and go, well, I can either, as a career progression, go further up, become more involved in business management, and lose any connection with actually reporting or learning about science. Or I can come out the other end and just be someone who gets to pick and choose some reporting here, some editing there, and things like that. Very common, actually. I mean, I'm thinking about, I don't know if you know Peter Alders.
Yeah, sure.
Who is a big figure in science journalism. He would have worked in basically the top journalism jobs, New Scientist, Nature, and Science. And he's come out the other end, and he freelanced.
Yeah, I think he was with BuzzFeed News for some time.
BuzzFeed for a while. He teaches a course in California now. So it's actually very common for people, I think, not to have to stick to some sort of pre-planned career path.
Yeah. Maybe one thing is books. There is this perception, whether right or wrong, that if you write a book, you are somehow upgrading to another category. If someone reads it, of course.
It's a big status thing, actually, to have
It's a status.
It is a status thing to have a book. I have a book, which I did as a contract. Which I did as a contract job. Probably the worst paying work that I did in my freelance career, actually. But I went into it knowing that I was actually going to get a fixed fee. I don't get money from copies of the book sold. I just get a fixed fee for making it, and there you go, goodbye. And I just wanted the experience of being involved in producing a book. So that's fine. But most of the people, some quite big names actually, who have written several science books, make almost no money out of it. It's a really tough way to make a living writing books.
Sarah, you still have something for us, otherwise?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe him, maybe you.
Yeah, just a similar question maybe to Nina. I was wondering if, out of curiosity, if you as a scientific editor are evaluated by certain metrics. For example, would you have an analog of a age index to the number of papers that you got through and their citations on the future or something like that?
Yeah, at least for now, I've not heard of anybody being judged, thankfully, by the citations of the papers we pull through, which also, I mean, across the board, that would also be really unfair because certain areas have more citations. If you say compare our superconductivity people with our particle physics editor, I mean, they just have very different timescales. Or someone working in energy materials, it's the same. Basically, if you compare impact factors of journals, you have the same issue. There are metrics that we have to work to, which are targets for how many papers to publish a year, and turnaround around times and how fast I make decisions. And then some on, of course, but they're the same kind of things you would have in any industry job. If you go into industry, people get targets on how much they have to do, what they have to produce by the end of a certain project or something. So nothing like an age index. It's quite sort of standard industrial, how fast, how much things.
There was another, you can do a couple of questions there.
Following up on what you just said, I don't know exactly in Nature journals how it works for peer reviewers, if they are paid or compensated or not. But so it's kind of volunteer work. So how do you manage to deal with deadlines or deal with timeframes as an editor when you have to interact with volunteering?
You have to politely remind them. And I, for one, am very understanding when people say, look, I can't do this in the 2 weeks you're asking, but I can do it in 4. I'll probably just say fine. I'd rather people just told me I need longer, rather than if they say, yes, I can do it in 2 weeks, and then they need 6 months. You have to be, again, that's the people skills you need in this job. You have to be very polite. And of course, if people decline to review, it's their choice. If they want to decline with a rant at me that we don't pay peer reviewers, I have to deal with it. But at the end of the day, I'll just have to say, thank you, I accept your opinion, and I'm going to ask you again to review for us if that's what you want.
Well, yeah. If you think about it, that's fine, because you have an industrial process, because it's an industrial process where you have one factor that you can't really fully controlled. You
No,
don't have leverage.
don't get me started on that target. I have a target for how long the review's going to take.
Can I ask a follow-up to
Yes,
that? So
sure.
Nature, I don't know if the Nature research journals do this, but Nature, a year or 2 years ago, started experimenting with open peer review, where the peer reviewers can choose to be named in a
We all
special
do that.
acknowledgement
Yes, we all
section
do
of
that.
the paper.
Yeah, we all do that now.
Has that, because I love that as a journalist, because it's like instant sources, you know, we've already peer reviewed this paper, you're all over it, tell me what you think about it. But has that made potential peer reviewers more willing to do it because they know that they're gonna get recognised for their community service?
Well, nobody's told me that it motivates them. And it also sort of coincided with pandemic and more papers and more submissions, so there is a bit of, it started for us at least at the same time that it became harder to find reviewers just because there was more and more to review.
Yeah.
So I can't really give you any
Yeah,
sort
fair.
of rule of thumb, but nobody's told me that it motivates. I've had people tell me that they hate it, but again, usually people tell you the negatives more than the positives.
So just a comment, there are some journals now that enable you to link the fact, you don't have to appear on the journal as a reviewer, but they can cross-link that to your ORCID information and stuff like that. So it is, in some sense, part of the CV now.
Yes.
The question is whether the community actually values that
Yeah.
as an impact parameter, right?
Right.
We're all assessed by our age factor, but the number of papers that we review every year is probably not one of the reasons why we get hired in universities. Which
Yeah.
brings me to, one of the questions here, which is, is it fair? The fact that this reviewing work is voluntary and not rewarded, with money or in other ways, is that something that is fair, and is there anything that can be done to change that? I don't have an opinion, I don't know if it's here, I'm just
I don't think I
relating.
have an answer to that.
Well,
That's an entirely different discussion.
one common political answer, and I'll just leave it to the discussion, is that it isn't systemically free because a part of the salary of professors is supposed to be for community service. I knew I got the face. But that's probably the answer that someone who thinks about the system of science will give. It's part of the job that comes with the job.
But that only answers the remuneration question. It doesn't answer the being rewarded
incentives,
in
yes.
terms of career
Yes.
progression and other things.
Of course.
Personally, I also think that there is a case, now I might be hated by my colleagues, to be made for not being paid for review papers, because it changed, the way you work might change as a result.
You would also have to do it out of hours, because otherwise you're double billing. Otherwise you'd be getting paid by your university and by a journal for working at the same time, probably using university facilities.
Yeah.
No, I hate the idea of being paid
And
for peer review.
in principle, you would need official permission from your university to do outside work at the universities, which I know researchers never think about, but in principle, you need your HR to sign off on these things, so it's a bit more complicated.
I think the solution is greater recognition for the
Yes,
role that
I
peer
would
review
absolutely
plays
agree with that.
within your scientific community.
So, sorry, I'll give precedence to people who haven't
Thank you.
talked yet. Yes.
How much do you think it's important to have an experience as a peer reviewer if someone is looking for a career path as an editor?
It's important to have been a peer reviewer.
Not really. I think I reviewed 3 papers as a researcher, so I became an editor. You should have experience of having published a paper, so you know the process that I described earlier, how that works, so you've experienced it as a researcher. In a way, it's probably better if you've not reviewed that much, because when we train people, what we spend most of the time usually is to drill the reviewer mindset out of people's mind, because looking at a paper as a reviewer is very different from looking at a paper as an editor. And I usually find people with more reviewer experience are harder to train because they have this ingrained a bit more.
It's very interesting.
Hopefully will be
As a peer reviewer, what you're really supposed to look at is the technical flaws of the paper. Whereas as an editor, what you have to look at is how does this paper sit in the context of its field? So what is it built on? What does it contribute as a novel, whatever that means, factor? And what does it enable the field to do? So the question you typically ask is, if this is technically correct, which I can't tell, then what impact will it have? Whereas a lot of people who've reviewed a lot will look less at that and just go, yeah, but there is that experiment, I'm not sure if they've done everything there, and maybe they should do another control experiment. I don't believe that the reviewers can tell them if they need to do that control experiment. That's not your job. You have to decide if it's worth getting 3 people to spend their time reading this to tell us if they need a control experiment.
So you rely basically on the reviewers to assess that.
Mostly, yes. I mean, we have some expertise, obviously. You get an idea over time of what's necessary and what's not, but for the details,
Which again comes down to the centrality of the reader.
Yes.
As you said. Yeah, we have one there. Sorry, then I'll
Okay, I just shortly also wanted to ask for a little bit more insight into this interaction and process between the reviewers and the editor. Maybe it also differs a bit. Maybe in Nature Journal, it's already, as an editor, you do more and maybe you also communicate more with the authors. But generally, it's such, right, that for the authors, the editor, apart from the initial decision to send it to review, is quite invisible, and it's only the reviewers with whom one is discussing and with whom one is also discussing about the merit of the paper, right? Not only the technical stuff, but it's, especially in the more fancy journals, it's always about somehow convincing the reviewers that what you did is actually interesting, you know?
Yeah, so the funny thing here is that we are happy and nearly every week overrule reviewers on the interesting bit. What I will not overrule them on is whether the paper is correct or not. And sometimes we go to quite lengths to find out if that's the case. Of course, we take advice from the reviewers about what is interesting or not. Basically, if 3 experts in the field say, nah, really, who cares about this, then my first call probably was wrong. So if the specialists don't care, the wider community probably doesn't care either. But yes, it's true that we can be quite invisible in the normal back and forth with the reviewers, but that doesn't mean that we don't read everything and don't make the decisions. That is for professional editors. I know a lot of journals editors aren't allowed to overrule reviewers, like not the Nature journals, but some journals. So there are a lot of papers where I don't communicate with the authors that much. There are papers when I actually have phone calls with authors when they want to talk about what the reviewers are asking for and what is and what isn't possible and what I would need for the paper to pass my bar. So it goes through that entire spectrum. Typically, it's just emails going, well, we can do what reviewer 2 asked for there, but that request from reviewer 3 isn't possible or necessary because of that, and then you discuss if I think it's necessary.
Yeah, I'm asking this question because I was sometimes wondering why there's not also a text written by the editor to the authors, just like the reviews of the other reviewers, to which one as an author, so where you would like tell your position, why you think that maybe it's interesting, but maybe it's a bit sketchy. And so the authors can answer to this, right? Because
we do we do sometimes give context in the decision letter to the reviewer. Comments. Yes, of course, everything I said was a decision. I'm not going to send you an email and then send you another email with my decision.
Point of peer review, sorry.
Yes, but I'm not part of the peer reviewers, the
How
editorial.
can you decide with hundreds? No, I mean, no, sorry, I don't want to, but no, I mean, in this, I don't want to make a fuss about this. It's just, so, like the reviewers, usually, it depends, right? But usually they don't really, some are perfect expert and they give super nice comments, others have no idea about what actually went on in the paper. So, I mean, everyone knows this. right? And I expect that you have a very broad knowledge about the field, so you have a very good eye for what needs to be done, but still, it's very probable, right, that if you would give the authors the ability to communicate actually about the relevance or, you know, what the paper actually means for the larger field and so on, that there would be interesting things coming up. So I'm wondering why this
Authors
is.
do, it's called a cover letter. That's exactly what a cover letter is for, where you can tell these things to the editor. And frankly, why it's interesting to the field, because you need to tell your readers as well.
Yeah, I mean, but what, you know, what is in, oh, sorry, but.
Sorry, because I see other raised
I'm
hands.
getting an answer, sorry.
Maybe we can take it up.
Yeah, there's an aperitif to go on. One there and then one.
The discussion on the difference between a reviewer and an editor.
Yep.
As an editor, do you think it's interesting for people in the paper, the limits of, for example, the model you're using or the limits? But I know it was common fashion is a few decades ago, but now there is this, I would say, there is this tip to not do it because it will make the peer review process more difficult.
One of the most common themes in terms of reviewer reports that I see in papers is the authors need to discuss the limitations of their findings more. Reviewers explicitly ask. I can't necessarily speak for the materials modeling community because I don't see many of those papers, but in principle, reviewers ask for that a lot. And when we ask people to write a news on the paper, we also explicitly ask them to discuss the limitations of the findings if they can. Because as we know, people, for some reason, we had it earlier, people think they need to hide everything. And nobody is more fed up with reading the hype than somebody who reads 10 of those a day or 10 of those a week. So you're not ingratiating yourself to us for that. You're not ingratiating yourself to the reviewers who can see through it. So doing the scientifically correct thing of saying, this is what our model can do, but I can't, this does not necessarily apply to the entire family of these materials, for example, because it has these limitations of whatever, how many atoms it can handle. That is perfectly fair to say, because people will ask.
And journalists also will typically look for limitations because that's part of not taking things at face value and expanding the team.
I was just thinking how in so many of my stories, there's a paragraph that, depending on how big the limitation is, it'll either be a line or two about it, usually in the second paragraph, and then there'll be a bigger paragraph, about 5 or 6 paragraphs in, which is say, you know, well, despite this, it's not going to find its way into devices immediately because gallium nitride is doing it perfectly well. However, it might lead to new thinking about better ways to dope it or something like that. Or you flag up right at the top in this proof of principle work, yada, 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 this is what they've done. So it's really important. Otherwise, you lose credibility with your readers. Like I said, it's not just the general audience that I'm writing to. I am writing to world experts in the thing that I'm writing about. So it needs to be credible.
And just to pick that up, what Mark said about his writing is equally true for your writing. You're writing for your readers. Those are your fellow researchers, not the peer reviewers and not me. We're just people sort of stepping stones towards that. But at the end of the day, if you give a talk about your work at a conference and you don't talk about those limitations, somebody's got to put their hand up and ask, well, is this also going to work for X? So those are the people you're writing for. They want to know that's just good scientific practice.
I also have a question for you. You mentioned during your talk that about 70% of the papers are rejected before peer review process. Yeah, I mean, there's a
something like that, between 70 and 80.
Do you have an estimate of those papers, how many actually stood a chance to get published? Because there are papers that
The
are.
ones we send out for peer review, 55% of those get published.
Okay.
So once we've sent it out to peer review, it's slightly better than half.
No, sorry, what I meant
Oh,
was.
in general,
Not in general, but the ones that you rejected,
yes.
there must be papers that are just outright like wrong science and things, or are all the papers really good?
I mean, a lot of our papers our submissions are quite good, so we have tools that I rarely look at that actually track where the papers that we reject go. But I mean, of all the papers, including the ones we reject in peer review, I would say it's probably somewhere between 1 to 5%, if not less, that don't get published.
Yeah.
Because, yes, it's almost all of them. There will be some that are just plain wrong. There are, when I say plain wrong, most of that just means they don't stand up to the claims that the authors are making. The science is possibly still right, it's just the interpretations don't hold up. So a bit like my PhD, you might still publish it as something that's less exciting and therefore not nature physics, but not incorrect. Most of them are proper science. I should say, when we have all these numbers, we don't include our massive number of Frank submissions. We do get a lot of the Einstein is wrong variety, but they aren't even counted at those. Those I hope will never get published anyway. But that's a different story.
I have one question, but maybe.
So we've talked a lot about target readers, and I guess that can mean many different things. Here I have a question, I think, for Mark. As a science journalist, how do you explain new scientific advancement to the public? Now I think we're talking about the general public, when there is stark disagreement among experts on their significance. If 2 experts say a new paper is groundbreaking and 3 say it's trivial, how do you talk about it in your article?
For the general public. Well, I mean, one way to tackle that is the amazing if true. You know, the new paper has been lauded, blah, 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 but it has stirred controversy by others saying it's a sham, or it's you know, old news or whatever. Whichever is true is certainly stirring discussion and so on and so on. So partly about the framing of the way that you write it. It might affect whether you decide to write about it at all, depending on what those people have to say about it. I feel like I'm missing something with that question. I'm not quite understanding what you want me to get at.
It's an online question, so I can only help you guess. But in general,
If I can interpret
please,
the question,
please.
and I think maybe it has something of the, you know, the old false balance problem in it. And the way I read it is, should you as a journalist at some point make a decision on who is right, waving in, you know, the credibility of the experts, again, parameters like their professional standing, H index or whatever, or do you prefer to just keep to reporting the controversy, reporting the different opinions, and, you know, stay in an observer position?
I see. No, that's an easier thing to answer. All right. So the point is, if you've got 3 earth scientists who are saying, you know what, the earth is only 5,000 years old, there's no evidence for all the, you know, millions of years, billions of years of Earth's history at all, then it might be incumbent on the journalists to inquire whether they are part of any creationist foundation or so on. Do you see what I mean? So if they are, that clearly undermines the credibility of what they're saying. So yes, you do assess the credibility of the sources that you're quoting in the story. But I don't, you would never go into deep saying what's your age in there, or are you a professor as opposed to an assistant professor? I don't think that would it. Have you published in this area? Do you know what you're talking about? Do you have a vested interest, like a company that's putting forward a rival thing? I, for example, have I've been more cautious about using comments, certain extremely, I thought, unwarranted critical comments about technology that was about, that would seem more, you know, making it easy for electric vehicles to roll out. When those comments were coming from a scientist who has quite a prominent spin-out company that is working with a major car company working on hydrogen-powered vehicles, right? So that's somewhere where you really do have to be aware of their best interest and why they might be a committed pro-hydrogen, not so much on the lithium-ion batteries side. So yeah, you have to factor that into reporting. It might not, you wouldn't sort of not quote them all together because they're an expert in this field, but you'd be quite cautious about about how you frame it and whether you just blanket assume that their critical comments are correct.
Can I make one question, which is one of the answers that both scientists submitting papers, I guess, and both, for example, freelancers pitching stories to do implementations like Asia get, it could be a frustrating answer often is, oh, it's interesting, but it's not for us. It's somehow outside of our editorial scope, editorial policy. And I'd like to ask you in your respective fields, how formalized are those stuff? Like when you become an editor at Nature Physics or a news editor at Nature or another publication, do you get like a proper handbook that tells you what stories to look for, what are for Nature and what not? Or is it, more sort of oral knowledge that passes, from your colleagues and imitating what's already been published, etc. Because sometimes for outsiders, be them journalists or scientists, I know it's very hard to grasp them. So why is my proposal interesting but not for them?
The short answer is there's no handbook, and I think the same is true for journalists.
I suspect that,
There is no handbook.
But still there is a policy, still there is an image of what your
Yes, of course. So the way it works for us, it's actually less looking at what we've published before, and it's really what we do in training. So when an editor starts and we train them, it takes somewhere between a month and 3-4 months, depending on how quickly they pick it up. They will send for every paper they assess, they will send their notes and their reasoning to another editor, more senior editor who's training them. And that editor will then go back to the scientific method of critical thinking and ask silly questions about the reasoning of, oh, have you looked at that? Have you looked at reference 17? And why are you saying that? Why are you saying that compares like that? Have you considered this? How would that fit in the depth field? And so you send the things back and forth until you agree on whether or not the paper is for you. So it's very much on the job training, paper by paper, and this goes on for, like I said, between 4 weeks and 3-4 months with every paper. So that's quite a lot of papers that you're trained at. And then it kind of seeps into your brain.
There are two ways to approach your question from a journalist point of view. The first is, what should a nature editor commission? How do they make decisions about that? What pitches to pick up? Those are the different story areas that I outlined: scientific, advanced, community, policy, behind the headlines. And the thing is, you will be getting feedback from your boss, the chief magazine editor, about, bloody hell, you seem to be doing a lot about this topic. Can we not just give it a rest for a bit? Or do you really think it was worth spending like 800 words digging into that really quite boring subject? Or whatever. So you will get that kind of feedback to modify what you're commissioning, but it is falling within that. There is no template. You are employed to use your judgment as an editor to make sure that you're serving the readers. But in terms of how to pitch, what an editor expects to receive when a journalist pitches them a story, they're doing it by email, for example. Actually, there is a template for that, and I'm amazed how few journalists actually use it when it's such a bloody obvious template to use. It's what is the news? Why is it important? When is it coming out? How could this affect the world or affect the field? What are the implications? When can you file? How long is it going to be? I propose this long. This is the art that could go with it. A 400-word cover note, set out like that, snappy to the point, you're almost telling half the story in a pitch.
The copy
right?
scale of the story.
Yeah. And there you go, that's it. Those kind of pitches do very well with editors, because editors can immediately see why they should want to read a fuller story of this. And weirdly, a lot of freelancers don't do that. I suspect a lot of the freelance journalists who struggle, that's one of the issues they struggle, actually, because they don't necessarily, maybe they've never worked as an editor, so they never, like me, seen hundreds of bloody awful pitches over their time. Anyway.
I don't know how long we can go, so I'll.
I mean, I would suggest this. Maybe I can ask the last question from someone who has not asked a question yet online. And, you know, you're all invited to join us for an apéro upstairs. So if there are more questions or more curiosities for our guests, you have a chance to ask them. Okay? So the question is phrased slightly differently, but I want to redirect it towards the two of you, which is how important it is to write well as opposed to write correct, in a sense. What is the balance between, you know, the reaction you have to a poorly written paper that still contains solid and interesting science? Oh.
Depends how we define poorly written. I often get that question when I'm, for example, in China. If your English is bad, it's not a problem. I do not mind if there are grammatical errors or anything like that. So if that's what we mean by poorly written, doesn't matter at all. With the one thing where I usually say, if I can't understand what you're doing, we have a problem. And that sort of feeds into the badly and well written in the proper writing sense. Of course, it always helps to have a well-written paper, because a bit like with your pitches, editors are busy people, no matter if it's my type of editor or Mark's type of editor. I don't have the time to spend 3 days picking apart what this paper is actually doing. I have to assess it in a few hours. And if I can't figure out what the interesting thing is within a few hours, I'll probably decide to not bother. Thankfully, that doesn't happen very often. So it needs to be written well enough, either the paper or the cover letter, for the editor to understand basically what Mark just said in his pitch, minus the filing and everything. Basically, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Why are you doing it now? Why should your community, therefore I care? That should be clearly in a paper. Everything in between, the whole technical part, in that sense, doesn't matter so much how well it's written for my decision. It matters for your reviewers and your readers, so please write it well still. But for the editorial decision, it's that introductory pitch of your paper. If that's clear, it helps make a decision. We'll try to dig into it. We do look into references and stuff, but again, I don't have 3 days for one paper.
I remember when I started training as a journalist about 25 years ago, one of the first things that I heard was journalism is not about being good writers. It's not about writing well, because it's about reporting and other stuff, which is partly true, I think. You also have to write well.
Yeah, I mean, it depends also, I mean, you said, is it write well versus write correct? If you're not writing correct, to my mind, that means you're getting stuff wrong. You're making factual inaccuracies. That's verboten. That is just not on in journalism. Do not get stuff wrong. If there is uncertainty, frame the uncertainty about it. But don't state things which are wrong. So for me, that's, I mean, is it important to write well? Yeah, it helps, definitely. But yeah, first, do no harm. First, get nothing wrong, I would say. I had staff reporters on Nature who were not great writers, but they were the most amazing journalists because they had such good community connections. They got stories that you would just never get in mainstream media, you would never get from non-specialist journalists because they really knew their community a lot. And the writing you can fix. What you need is the story and the accuracy.
And maybe if I can just follow up on the question of what means writing well. In a technical context, paper to an extent, also in science journalism, any technicality. Writing well in that context means writing simply. It doesn't mean writing Dickens or Tolkien or anything, it means writing simply because then people understand. It's about communicating and not about winning a poetry prize.
Well, thank you very much, Nina and Mark. I think it's been great. So I hope that our audience. Well, thank you everyone again for being with us tonight, and I think we can move on a well-deserved aperitif.
Sorry for those who are applying.
But yeah.